If I could have your attention, we're going to go ahead and get started for the LCFS session. My name is Jessica Dell, and I'm the Editorial Manager for Environmental Markets at Argus Media. We have an excellent group here to discuss the status of LCFS markets, and I am pleased to introduce directly to my right, Bill Peters. Bill is Clean Fuels Program Manager at the Oregon DEQ, and also a former colleague of mine. And then to the right of Bill is Joel Creswell, Climate Pollution Reduction Program Manager at Washington State's Department of Ecology. And to his right is Jordan Godwin, Director of Renewable Fuels at OPIS. You may notice from the panel we don't have Carb with us because unfortunately Jordan was sick and not able to come, so we will focus more of the discussion on Oregon and Washington, where there is plenty to unpack for those states. This is definitely an opportune time to discuss LCFS markets. As Rajinder discussed this morning, California is working swiftly to resubmit to OAL the LCFS rulemaking, and of course we've seen prices really tumble on the back of that disapproval. And as credit generation has continued to weigh on prices in California's LCFS market, credit prices in Oregon's market now sit at a premium. So we'll get to hear Bill speak about the status of that program. And then further up the coast, the Department of Ecology in Washington State is working on a number of updates to their CFS. And at the same time, lawmakers in Washington State are working towards tightening those CI targets there as well. So without further ado, I'll have Bill go up to stage to just give a status update on Oregon. And then Joel will follow, and then we'll move to discussion. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone. Let me give me one second to switch over onto the slide deck I brought. I'm going to skip a number of my slides because I put them together while we were, Jordan, when we found out that Carb wasn't here, so I was doing some padding, and I'm going to take out that padding now that Joel has thankfully sucked in, so you don't have to hear me going for longer than I should. Anyway, hi, Bill Peters. I've worked at Oregon DEQ since 2016 on the Clean Fuels program, which was the first year that our program started operating. We're the third LCFS that got going behind BC and California's. And this year is the end of the first compliance schedule that we had adopted. So we're at the 10% reduction target here in 2025. We get our program data in on a delay. So what you're seeing in the green line here is what the program has actually achieved through the middle of 2024, which is when we have all the data for. We have Q3 data in, but it's incomplete because we calculate some of the electricity credits on a different schedule. So we'll have our end of year 24 data published in hopefully about 2 months from now. Well, or beginning of May is probably the better way for me to phrase that. So our program back in 2022 extended our targets out to 2035. We have fairly aggressive targets, and you can see how that increases over time. A lot of that is just to do with light-duty ZEV adoption. As we see more EVs, we both get the declining fossil fuels from gasoline and diesel, and so you have to start ramping up those targets in the out years. Like I mentioned, the program's been in place since 2016. We've supported over 13.3 million tons of reductions in our transportation sector since then. It is smaller versus the California equivalent numbers, but I guess keep in mind we have about 1/10 of the population, so we don't burn quite as much as they do down here. Our credit market has grown and been fairly stable over the last few years, with about $200 and $300 million in clean fuels credits being traded annually, and then some larger number that's also just transacted along with the liquid fuels that are part of the program and generate credits, but don't necessarily have credits transfer between parties as part of that. We've also seen health benefits from both helping support the electrification of the state's transportation sector, and then also swapping out fossil diesel for renewable and biodiesel, both of which tend to be better on a health, air pollution side of things, in addition to the climate benefits we're able to achieve through them. Our compliance picture looks kind of similar to how California's has. We're seeing a lot more renewable diesel. We have the, which is in the lighter blue off on this graph. The darker blue is electricity, and that's been increasing pretty steadily over time. It dips down at the very end here because we don't have some of the electricity credits from residential charging generators. So that's just a data artifact that will get cleared up once we have our Q4 data set published. And otherwise, other fuels have lowered their carbon intensity. The fuel producers have found ways to squeeze carbon out of their processes, which is the design of the policy, and we've seen increasing use in a number of cases there. So I'll talk really quickly about the rulemaking that we just wrapped up in January. It was a smaller rulemaking than the ones that my colleagues in the North and South have taken on. Ours is done. It is fully enrolled. Our rules are in effect at this point. I don't usually feel a need to say that, but just given the back and forth of the California rulemaking, I want to make that clear. So our last rulemaking did a number of technical changes, including updating the core carbon intensity model for the program, which we call OR-GREET, which is basically a sister model to the California GREET model. This is a way of trying to explain all of the GREET models. I will not spend too much time on this slide. There's just a number of emissions factors that go in there. It's based off the Argonne created version. And then we have simplified calculators, which are basically the more usable calculators. For those of you who have not had the pleasure of opening up GREET, it will mess up your computer in one way or another. So the simplified calculators are there because they're easier for us to review, they're easier for verifiers to review, and they're hopefully at the level where a biofuel plant operator can fill out that data themselves and understand what's going on with their carbon intensities. So we have a number of those that we've adopted and that updated in that last rulemaking. The fun part is that when we adopt the new models, that means we need to get everybody on them. So my team will be busy this year. We're working at transitioning everybody from the old carbon intensity models to the new ones, which basically mean we've got several hundred carbon intensity scores to recalculate and reissue for 2026 reporting. So we're doing that as part of our normal annual field pathway reporting cycle. And I guess I should have gone up front and said, like, raise show of hands who knows what an LCFS is. I'm kind of assuming people are familiar with it, but like if somebody starts looking panicked at me, I will try and explain more as I go. That process is basically where we confirm that the values in the program, the carbon intensity scores are being used to generate valuable credits are true and accurate, and that fuel producers have maintained their operational real-time carbon intensity value below that certified one. We get an annual report every year with updated data from the fuel producers. So what we're doing this year to try and get everybody over onto the new model in one big push is having them submit both data in the old model and the new model. Old model we'll use to make sure they're still in compliance with all the reporting that happened last year. New model will be what we use to issue values for 2026, and then we'll move on from there. Last time we did this, we had like a 2-year period where they submitted pathway applications under the new model when they're ready to, which basically mean we had a bunch of people who had lower scores under the new model submit in like January and February, and then everybody else waited until December of the end of that transitionary period, and then we're surprised that we could not process that many pathway applications in just a couple months. So this is our way of trying to avoid that and trying to just treat everyone fairly and just do it all in one go. We do also have a number of changes on the fossil fuel carbon intensity scores. These are basically just summarizing them. Gasoline went down a little bit because it turns out that the crude slate that's going through the refineries in Joel's state was cleaner than we thought previously under the old model. A lot of that's around Alaska North Slope crude just having a somewhat less carbon intensity than we thought it did previously due to some of the modeling updates that we did. On the diesel side, the carbon intensity went up because of increased nitrous oxide emissions, which is N2O, which is highly potent greenhouse gas and is separate from NOx, which is the ozone precursor, but very easy to confuse on those two. Because there are increased nitrous emissions out of diesel engines, the carbon intensity of diesel went up under the new model, which is something that we're going to have take effect with all the other carbon intensity scores next year in 2026. And then for natural gas, which is I think this is the last year natural gas can generate credits in the program because it was a lower carbon fuel than diesel, but the standards have now reached the point where they'll intersect. So natural gas no longer be credit generating, but that went up a little bit largely from increased understanding of methane leakage along those pipelines. Okay, and I'll go through my next couple slides really quickly. So I'm going to skip this one because it's for smaller, but one thing that always happens when we update our program's baseline, the carbon intensity scores that we're using to calculate the percentage reduction targets, is that we have to adjust the standards. Because we were not adjusting the percentage targets in our rulemaking, that basically leads us to the outcome we've got here, where the gasoline standard goes down a little bit because gasoline is a little bit less carbon intense under the model updates that we did, and then the diesel standard goes up a little bit, so it's a higher CI value because the fossil diesel carbon intensity score went up a bit under the new model. And I think, let me see, was there anything else I wanted to cover? The only other thing that we really did in this rulemaking was expanding the scope of our third-party verification program. Now they've had it in place for a few years. We're expanding it so that both electricity reporting will need to be verified starting with the current data year, so the 2025 data year, and those verifications will happen in 2026. And then also we're requiring fuel pathway applications to also go through that process. Largely that's due to issues we've seen on some of the fuel pathway applications where, like, when they finally have a verifier go over the data, issues have cropped up. We also have a certain number of smaller fuel producers that have not gone through verification because they're under the annual threshold that we require verification for. So the goal here with that change in the rules is basically to make sure that everybody has gone through verification once, and we have some sense that the values being used in the program have had that second set of eyes on them from the verifiers. And with that, I will pass it over. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bill. And you made a good point. For anyone that is in the room that is maybe just less familiar with the LCF programs, I'll just take a quick step back and just really quickly simplify it. So these are programs designed to decrease the carbon intensity of the transportation fuel mix. So they work to displace gasoline and diesel use and increase the use of renewable fuels on the road, like biodiesel, renewable diesel, RNG, and also in the air with sustainable aviation fuel as a credit generator. And so efforts to increase the stringency of the CI targets will then ultimately give more demand boost for renewable fuels and EVs, and that is what California is in the process for. So again, Bill, thank you for taking us through everything going on in Oregon, and we'll unpack that more in our Q&A. But now I'll turn to Joel for Washington State update before we get to that.
All right. Well, thanks, Jess, and thanks, Bill, for starting us off. And I'll apologize to y'all for two reasons. One, I don't have any slides, so that's maybe a sorry, not sorry kind of thing. Excuse me. And also, I'm not carbs, so Jordan Rummelingham fell ill and was unable to come down. So apologies. You get Washington as your consolation prize. And since it's the middle of the afternoon in a warm room, I do want to do the public participation thing that the last panel did. So I'm just curious, by a show of hands, who in the room is engaged in some way with California's LCFS? Excellent. Oregon's? All right, got some Oregon fans. Washington's? British Columbia? Canadian Federal? Okay, great. And who likes Bill's floral tie? Okay. Well, all joking aside, thanks everybody. So I wanted to give you a brief status update on Washington's clean fuel standard. It's funny, we've all chosen slightly different names. California has an LCFS, Oregon has a clean fuels program, Washington has a clean fuel standard. They all effectively mean the same thing, although it's important to note that none of them are linked the way that cap and invest markets are linked or linking. So our program started in 2023, and so it's had 2 full years of operations so far. In that amount of time, we have gotten up to 300 registered participants and over 5 million credits generated. In the first year, RCFS reduced 1.4 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, meaning credits generated, which, to translate into more relatable numbers, is about 340,000 gas-powered cars. So, these programs are having real impact, and that's, I think, really important and exciting. And then in 2024, we don't have our full numbers in, but we are on track to have a reduction of over 2 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. We've had really strong participation across different sectors of the transportation economy. So fossil fuel producers, transit agencies, renewable liquid fuel producers, EV automakers, EV charging providers, forklift fleets, public and investor-owned electric utilities, really pretty broad-based. Most of our credit generation at present comes from electricity, renewable diesel, and ethanol, followed by other liquid biofuels. Our credit price, anybody who tracks this will know, has varied a lot over time. It's currently quite low. That's due to oversupply of credits relative to deficits. This is something that has been the case across the West Coast, but Washington came into the market or came into the clean fuel space at a time when clean fuels technology had really advanced, thanks in many ways to the other jurisdictions with programs in place, but with a relatively slow ramp up in our compliance stringency that was set by our legislature. And so right now we have 2 to 3 times more credits than deficits being generated. And so over the course of 2023, we saw a rapid decline in our credit prices. They dipped about an average of $74 per credit. So they were at $40 in June 2023, $23 per credit in January 2025. And so that is a price point where we are not seeing the level of investment in renewable fuel infrastructure in the state that we have a statutory mandate to maintain. So the program is supposed to be driving investment, and at the moment it's not really effectively doing that. So we're in rulemaking at the moment to better align the incentives of credit generation with activities that will lead to renewable fuel investment in the state. And there's also a bill that's live in the legislature that'll touch on that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But what are we doing in this rulemaking? A number of things, and some of them are not directly related to sort of fixing the market imbalance. One of the things we're doing is adding third-party verification. Bill already talked about that. That's just an important step. The other programs have that, and we want to ensure that all of our emissions reductions are real, robust, and verified. We're also implementing a tax credit for sustainable aviation fuel. That tax credit is based on carbon intensity reductions as certified by the Department of Ecology. So we are adding some SAF provisions to the program and changing up some of the ways that SAF is sustainable aviation fuel, some of the ways it's eligible to generate credits. And then we're also looking at book and claim accounting and avoided methane crediting for renewable natural gas, looking at ways that those policies can be adjusted so that over time they are incentivizing higher investment in facilities in Washington state. Those are some of the ways by rule that we are working on sort of better aligning the credit incentives with in-state investment. But that's a good segue into what's going on in the legislature right now. So there is a bill live, 1409, for those of you keeping score, that would increase the stringency of our program. It's currently statutorily set to 20% by 2038. By rule, we're allowed to move that deadline up to 2034. The bill that's active and may or may not pass at this point, it's uncertain, although it is still alive at this point in session and the way our session works. There are a number of cutoffs beyond which bills die if they haven't made progress, and it's passed all of the cutoffs to date. That would raise the carbon intensity standard to 45%, and then if by 2032 the state is not on track to meet its transportation emissions reductions mandated by statute, then the carbon intensity would go up to 55%. So that's the current version of the bill. It could still change. And that increase in stringency would obviously do a lot to address the market imbalance. Stepping back from credit prices and credit and deficit supply, we also have some other exciting things that exist in California, which is our fast charging infrastructure provision and our hydrogen refueling infrastructure provision. So in case you're not familiar, these infrastructure credits give developers partial credit for making charging and hydrogen refueling infrastructure available. They generate more credits if they're dispensing fuel, but because there is a big upfront cost to putting in these pieces of infrastructure, they can generate partial credit for making them available. We've issued about 3,500 fast charging infrastructure credits. And then the hydrogen refueling infrastructure, we have not yet launched, but we're making great progress. We're working with the hydrogen industry on they're finalizing a system that will measure station uptime, which is a requirement for us to have before we can issue those credits. And once that's in place, then we'll be able to open up applications for those. Our electric utilities are who get the credits for residential EV charging. And then they have a requirement to invest those credits in transportation electrification projects within their service areas. And they will start reporting to us in April of this year. So we're really excited to learn about the projects that they're investing those credit revenues in. Similarly, for the utility districts where the utility does not opt in to generate those credits, we've named a backstop aggregator. This was a provision we borrowed from Oregon. We actually went through a competitive selection process and selected the same backstop aggregator Oregon has. It's called Fourth Mobility, or Fourth Mobility Fund. And so they sweep the credits from any utilities district that has not opted in, and then they invest in transportation electrification as well. So again, we'll get reporting on that later this year. And I will stop there, and happy to take questions later on.
Jill, thanks very much for giving an update both on ecology and the bill working its way through the legislature. I do want to mention that after our kind of moderated discussion, we'll absolutely open it up to audience questions. I know it's helpful for the regulators to know what is on everyone's mind, so please do be thinking of your questions, and we'll make sure we make time for that. I'd like to start with a question for the panel, and Joel, this kind of touches off what you mentioned in terms of the concerns of where the WCFS credit price is now and what kind of signals that's sending. So in your view, at the moment, kind of would West Coast LCFS program send the appropriate signals for low carbon fuels growth this year? And then also curious kind of for your view in Oregon. It sounds like maybe not, but then SB 1409 could change that. But yeah, curious how you see that now.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's hard as a regulator to answer what's the right signal. And I will say that we are seeing far more renewable diesel come into the state than our initial forecast predicted. Our initial forecast, which we did back in 2022, predicted that we'd have this oversupply problem in the mid-2030s, and we got it in the mid-2020s. So obviously technology is moving faster than we predicted, which is a good problem to have. So there are some good market signals, but at the same time, I don't necessarily have a lot of hard data to back this up, but if you just look at the simple economics of it, if you are somebody who is developing a fuel with a really low CI, you're going to send it to the state where you get the best incentive. And so, right now that's Oregon. So fuels are movable. So I think, part of I mentioned we have the statutory requirement to maintain a healthy credit market. But part of what that means is that the direction is to maintain a credit price that is harmonized with the other jurisdictions. That's vague on purpose, but I don't think anybody would argue that our credit price is harmonized with the other jurisdictions right now. So that's part of why we are taking the action that we can take to sort of better align our stringency in the hopes that that will then better harmonize the credit price.
Thanks, that. Bill?
Yeah, it's a good question, and also one that really depends on who you're asking, right? Like for the low carbon fuel suppliers, they always want the highest credit price possible. For other folks and others interested parties in the state, the fuel suppliers, a lot of them are looking for more low fuel credit prices because that affects their businesses. I think that we also did not anticipate the amount of renewable diesel build out that we have seen subsequent to that 2022 rulemaking. I mentioned the modeling we did back in 2020 and 2021 for it. One of the unique features of the Oregon program is that we have not had a cap and trade program alongside it. BC has a carbon price through the carbon tax, though it has some weird features on biofuels, but we have more that rests on the clean fuels credit price than the other jurisdictions do because of, other than 2011 through 2014 for the California program when cap and trade had not yet expanded to the transportation sector. I started coming to this conference back in 2012, 2011, so I remember those days when somebody in the room was on a named lawsuit about if that program should keep going. But balancing these programs is hard. We don't know what the supply of fuels will be like. As Joel was just mentioning, it's very easy for a lot of the fuels to move around the jurisdiction where they will get the highest credit price. For the liquid fuel folks, that is something they can do fairly easily, though they do have to hedge against what the credit prices will do once the fuel arrives. For the renewable electricity and RNG folks, they're basically making a decision at the time, very close when they're doing the reporting about which jurisdiction has the highest credit price, and that's where they'll send the lowest CI product to. So we see just a lot of variability in what the average carbon intensity of those fuels is, just based on where the credit price is. We're looking at if our targets are stringent enough in Oregon based on the market dynamics we've seen recently. I think the other area of uncertainty, right, is federal policy. We don't know, how 45Z will be fully implemented. We don't know what some of the other federal changes, including around tariffs that will affect out of country fuel producers that supply our markets, what those effects will be. So, the plus side of the state LCFSs is that our state law programs, we continue on no matter what, because we don't have a nexus to the feds. So, we're just trying to provide those stable investment signals, those stable market signals for, we are trying to continue our decarbonization path for the state's economy. And, transportation is, none of the sectors are easy, but transportation is one of the harder ones, just given the number of vehicles we all have on the roads.
Well, actually, that segues into another question I had, because obviously California is working on getting its rulemaking finalized and approved, so that would then see tighter CI targets. So is Washington State. As you said, there's the possibility of rulemaking on revising Oregon's targets. So I'm curious what kind of factors into that decision? Like, what are you weighing as you decide whether to take that step for the rulemaking for tighter targets?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't want to go too deep into the internal discussions we're having. We're trying to see what we do not have a better crystal ball than anyone else in the room, right? We are trying to set these targets in a way that they are achievable, they are aggressive, they will demand more than what we think business as usual will get, but also not be set so that they would create significant downsides in the broader economy or in the transportation sector. So we are looking to thread that needle on making sure that these are aggressive enough that they're achievable, that they maintain those strong investment price signals that Joel was mentioning, but they're not going to mess anything up. They're not going to create blowback of a scale that would cause the program's political support to be called into question, right? So finding out, we're looking at data as it comes in, we're looking at announcements as they come in, we're trying to also digest what the federal picture looks like and how that will affect these markets. If there are significant changes to this federal RFS or other policies, that might also create some pressures. But it is also just fundamentally a decision about as each quarter of data comes in, does it look like these targets are still set a bit too low and we could go higher? And then if we can go higher, what is the right level of additional ambition to put on the targets?
That's helpful, thank you. And you touched on obviously what's happening in DC, and I am curious, both Joel for Washington State and Bill for Oregon, does what's happening federally, what's been called the ungreening of the EPA, do you feel that puts more weight on state shoulders to then kind of counterbalance that? Like, does it make you think quite differently about the incentives you might need to create in your state for biofuels, given what we're seeing federally? Joel, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll jump in. I think it's a good question, Jessica. I think it puts a finer point on the importance of what we're doing. We can provide a lot greater certainty around the future of our work. Granted, we're in a legislative session and we're in a rulemaking, right? So that creates some uncertainty. But at the same time, people can be confident that Washington, Oregon, California are all going to continue on the path that they're on towards reducing their transportation emissions with these programs. And like Bill said, these programs they're state level programs. Any legal questions about whether or not they are state level questions, I think are pretty well settled. And so we don't really anticipate them being affected too significantly by what's going on at the EPA.
I think the one thing I'd add, the benefit of these programs, speaking more broadly, right? We are we're the West Coast states. We have fairly blue executives and legislatures, but most of the fuel producers that we deal with in the U.S. are in, the Corn Belt. They're in the Midwest. I was emailing last week with a producer in the northern Midwest, and the EPA changes do affect all those industries throughout the U.S., right? Like, it is not just a blue state issue, because we get a lot of our fuel from the quote unquote red states. The changes at the EPA can cause, we rely on the technical work that EPA does in a number of areas across my agency. They provided a lot of the grounding for greenhouse gas reporting, protocols for doing those assessments. It's EPA having issues does not mean it makes it easier on the states, but we do have, more consistent policy direction around, these decarbonization measures. But it doesn't mean that, issues, EPA like pulling back in certain areas or not continuing to operate programs like the EPA greenhouse gas reporting program won't cause issues, won't cause data gaps, won't cause us to have to react. We rely on, various EPA programs for aspects of how we quantify emissions under the clean fuels standards. We will need to probably make adjustments to some of those ways that we get fuel pathway applications in, what we're using for the data sources if EPA takes those out. So it's not like there's no effect on the programs, but our goal is to create that consistent investment signal and just show that we are continuing to try to decarbonize. This ideally, we work in climate policy. It is a very politicized state, but most of the work that we're doing is very technical, very just trying to keep the ball moving down the field.
Thanks, Phil. And turning back to Washington State, Joel, you mentioned, Washington State has lowest credit price along the U.S. West Coast, but it has a higher cap and trade price. And I'm curious if you think if the legislature is effective in tightening those CFS targets, whether you expect the topic of affordability concerns to come to the fore, because we certainly saw that play out with the California LCFS tightening the targets, and just curious if you think that'll be a major kind of point of discussion with everything.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it has been a topic of discussion throughout the time we've had the Cap and Invest program operating, and frankly, it hasn't been as much of a topic of discussion around the clean fuel standard just because right now the stringency is quite low, and so anybody's estimates of what it may add to a gallon of gas are so much lower than Cap and Invest that it sort of just doesn't make it into the conversation. I do think if there is a rebalancing, it may become more of a part of the conversation, but I think there are a couple of factors going on. One of them is that we feel, and we say this in all of our economics reports, that if you're just looking at the cost impacts of these programs in terms of the price of a gallon of gas or a gallon of diesel, then your frame is way too narrow. Because of course, with the clean fuel standard, it's about decarbonizing the liquid fuel pool for sure, but it's also about transitioning to other fuel pools where, one, we're not so restricted to, a single fuel pool, or even to liquid fuels that have to be moved long distances. And two, frankly, electricity is just a very cheap fuel. And so in as much as the program is facilitating folks making that transition, we think it's sometimes more effective to look at the total average cost per mile of transportation as a way of looking at what the program is doing over time. The other thing I'll say is that the correlation between Cap and Invest or clean fuel standard compliance costs and gas prices is not linear, and part of that is because nobody, when you go to the pump, sort of lists out, well, this is 2 cents from this fuel quality requirement and 4 cents from this county tax, and you just don't get that breakdown. You don't have transparency as to what goes into the price, and again, because the cost of compliance is higher, we've paid a lot more attention to this around our Cap and Invest program. But when the Cap and Invest program first launched in 2023, the allowance prices were high, gas prices shot up. So everybody said, aha, this made gas prices high. And then in 2024, allowance prices dipped way down and gas prices stayed high. And since then, we've seen several times where gas prices will dip as allowance prices are rising and vice versa, which just goes to show you, of course there's a contribution, but there's not a linear relationship there between what they are. And in part, that's because these are market-based programs, so everybody's cost of compliance is different.
Thanks for that. Another interesting, or I guess I should say unique element in Washington State that we don't have for Canada CFR, for Oregon CFP, or California LCFS is this element of tying the CFS targets to in-state biofuel production. And so I'm curious if you can speak to the efforts to change that and whether you think the current law makes it harder for those targets to strengthen over time, having that stipulation there for the in-state bioproduction. Yeah,
so what's currently in law, if I get this exactly right, there are a lot of fine details. There's a requirement that we have a 15% contribution from Washington feedstocks and at least one new facility capable of producing 60 million gallons by 2028, I think. And if I got all of that right, somebody should give me a lollipop. But the standard is fairly prescriptive, and And what happens is if that standard is not met, then we can't increase the carbon intensity reduction standard past 10%. HB 1409 proposes to change that to simply one new or expanded biofuel facility permitted in the state by, I want to say it pushes the date by 2 years up to 2030. So that bill would actually loosen that restriction a little bit. And also, it's worth noting that there are a couple of biofuel facilities in various stages. I mentioned our sustainable aviation fuel tax credit earlier, and there are 2 sustainable aviation fuel refineries that are in different stages of our State Environmental Policy Act process in the state, so working on constructing facilities. So, I won't opine on whether either the current target in law is achievable or whether the new one would be, but I think the 1409 represents a relaxing a little bit of what the standard is.
Thanks, Joel. So perhaps we take audience questions. I do just want to pause here for a moment and see if there are any audience questions.
Hello, my name is Evan Edgar of the Clean Fleets Coalition of California. Sean Edgar is my brother. We work in Oregon and Washington. One of the demand features on biomethane in California is advanced clean fleet rule, advanced clean trucks that are really limiting the future of using biomethane or RNG in their fleets. And low carbon fuel standard is going to phase it out by 2040 in California, and that's a bad deal because RNG should be forever. Just want to find out from Oregon and Washington how you guys, I know you guys are in flux on both of those, ACF and AT&T, and you can comment on that.
Do you want to go first?
You can go ahead.
Okay. Oregon has adopted the Advanced Clean Trucks rule. I have colleagues that are embarking on an active rulemaking right now, and I would leave it to them to describe what the potential changes are there. The vehicle rules are always tricky for those of you who don't follow them because under the Federal Clean Air Act, states other than California have the option of either just staying with the default federal requirements for vehicle emission standards or adopting California's. Back in the 70s when the Clean Air Act was adopted, the calculus was basically that they didn't want OEMs to have to face 50 different state standards. So either it was the California ones because CARB at the time had adopted, and I'm pretty sure it was CARB at the time, but get somebody who worked there correct me if I'm wrong, if it was called a different thing back then, had vehicle standards in place prior to the federal standards coming in. I think what your question gets at is one that we all puzzle through what the role of biomethane will be out once we get to the 2040s and 2050s. We can use biomethane for transportation. It has had that role. There's a lot of CNG vehicles, especially here in Southern California, because of the need to reduce diesel emissions over time. That being said, we also have a lot of different areas that need natural gas, either as a feedstock or as a heat source. There are significant difficulties with decarbonizing what we use natural gas for currently. So then a question that always has to come up when we're trying to think across programs is what is the best use of this fairly limited resource? We are not going to have that much RNG out in the future. If we're trying to decrease natural gas use, is it better to go into stationary applications? Is it better to go into chemicals as feedstocks or something like that? So when we're trying to puzzle through, it's always hard to think about it in terms of a single program because we need to try and have a more holistic look, especially, I have colleagues that work on the Climate Protection Program, which is a statewide cap on emissions. So trying to figure out where that biomethane has the best value for trying to just get as much decarbonization as we can of our state's economies is usually the way that I'd frame that question. It doesn't mean that the natural gas vehicles or biomethane that we've been able to support through the LCFSs, will go away, but it's just we have a fairly limited supply of it. It's hard to make a ton of very low carbon biomethane. So then, where does it go in the economy as we're taking that broader view of it?
And I would just add, Washington has also adopted advanced clean trucks and not advanced clean fleets at the moment. And advanced clean trucks doesn't phase out CNG trucks. They're not operating in large numbers in Washington. But I think everything Bill said is true. I think in Washington right now, there's a lot of excitement around RNG to SAF. You make it into sustainable aviation fuel, but I think everything he said about sort of figuring out as we decarbonize, like what's the highest and best use of that limited fuel, is something people are thinking about. But I mean, just strictly from a classical clean fuel standard perspective, as long as the CI is lower than the standard in a given year, then, it's a credit generating fuel.
And some people in California looking at moving RNG to reform it into hydrogen for the future. So that's what we got to look at if we have to go zero emissions. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Yeah. Yeah.
Evan Rosenberg, I'm with Fuse. We generate credits from EV charging under clean fuel programs. From time to time, there's a discussion inevitably about like linking programs or some sort of connection. I think there's a lot of like, structural barriers to doing so, and I don't know if it's come up as much recently, but have there been considerations for aligning verification requirements between programs, or even some sort of like reciprocity? A lot of the credit generators have the same, generally the same accounting methods and pathways, and the only difference is like geography, right, and maybe transportation distances, and yet they have to go through the same verification process, which is pretty intensive and can be cost prohibitive, especially with low credit prices. So any like consideration for some sort of like reciprocity or just making it easier across programs to get verification?
I'm going to just really quickly repeat that question for those listening online. Thank you for the question. The question was, these credit programs obviously are distinct, and so credits in one program aren't fungible in another, but is there any consideration for having streamlining verification processes amongst the different LCFS programs?
Thank you for letting us sidestep the language question. I'll say what we have in place, which is that on the fuel producer side of things, my program accepts the California verification statement. So that's because we have, since the beginning of the program, partly just because this is the only way it can work on the size of staff we have. We've accepted if something has been certified by CARB, and then you come to Oregon, we will basically do necessary adjustments. We already know it's been reviewed. So for those fuel producers that have a California pathway that's been recertified in Oregon, we take the California verification statement and all the updated data there. On the reporting side, it does get trickier because each of these states have stood up distinct verification programs. There are verifiers that have not gotten qualified in all the jurisdictions. There might not be different people at the same verification bodies. So trying to combine it for reporting would be trickier, especially since we do have more distinct reporting on that side of things we do on the annual fuel path reports, which generally it's the same data other than travel distances to the jurisdiction, or in the case of hydrogen or compressed natural gas or liquefied natural gas, like actual liquefaction or compression facility energy, which might be different than the default.
Thanks, Phil.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Evan. I would say, we don't have third-party verification yet, but similar to how Oregon does it, our goal is to the extent that we can to reduce the administrative burden on everybody, right? Our team is also small. CARB has the administrative resources of a small country, right? But most other states don't. And so it's taking advantage of the work that they have done, and it's minimizing the administrative overhead. The other thing I'll say is that we do talk a lot between our jurisdictions about how we can share information and resources in ways that A, make us more effective and efficient, and B, sort of are good for the regulated community. And so one thing that, if you don't spend a lot of time looking at state contract solicitation websites and digging in state budgets, you might not have noticed is that CARB is out with a solicitation right now for a contractor to build the next version of the credit bank and transfer system, the online platform, and that Washington also has money appropriated from the state legislature to join with CARB and co-develop that platform. And so that's one way in which our two states are saving money, which in Washington, we fund our program with a participation fee, so that's going to save the regulated community some money. But the other thing is that once we're operating on a common platform, I think that is going to allow, where it makes sense to do so, some data sharing between programs so that, who knows, don't take any of this as a promise of future features, but maybe you can go register once and just push that registration in both jurisdictions, right? And you can imagine other sort of economies of scale from doing that. So we are looking for ways that we can harmonize our administration, our requirements where it makes sense to do so.
OFRS can use the same.
Yeah, we don't have budget currently allocated, unfortunately.
Thanks, Joel. And Denise, I know you had a question as well.
Yeah, Denise Campbell, Argus Media. So we've talked a little bit about sort of how how y'all are working to mitigate some of the federal hurt and uncertainty right now. Given the immediate concern, is there any sort of discussion, whether it's with legislators, between yourselves, with your respective administrations, on sort of how to prevent this kind of thing from impacting your programs quite so much in the future? Were there any kind of measures at all?
And I will repeat that question. Thanks, Denise. Given the federal environment, is there discussion in the states on how to protect your programs, in a sense?
I think Bill had some good things to say on this earlier, in that, I mentioned that our programs are pretty safe from a legal perspective, but, for example, when the EPA's greenhouse gas reporting tool went down earlier this year, normally it goes down every year for a couple of days while they do administrative updates, and it comes back up. This year it was down for over 6 weeks. Nobody really knew if it was coming back. That had a big impact on our agency, in that we rely on that for some of our emissions reporting. And so luckily it came back, and we're able to continue using it, but we don't know how much longer it'll continue. So we are working on developing our own tools, similar actually to what California has done. I mean, for greenhouse gas reporting, California actually got funding from the EPA to build its own tool so that they don't rely on the EPA's tool anymore. We're doing the same thing with state funding, not actually specifically because of this recent EPA issue, that we started that process earlier and for different reasons, but we are building in that resilience at the state level. We're doing the same thing with our greenhouse gas emissions inventory, so none of this is specific to CFS, but to broaden the scope of your question, right now our greenhouse gas emissions inventory is produced mostly using EPA's state inventory tool. It's unclear if that will continue under the current administration, and so again, starting earlier and for different reasons, but we started building our own inventory from the ground up. And I would say all of our climate policies are in some ways intertwined, and so these policies do touch on, and also in some cases pull data from the Clean Fuel Standard. So there's a little bit of a connection there. But yeah, it's mostly just making sure that we are self-sufficient, such that if a federal tool goes away, that doesn't impact our ability to operate.
I mean, otherwise, we're market-based programs. If federal incentives go away, we have a fair amount of, given that the credit prices across the jurisdictions are on the lower end right now, there is a fair amount of room for them to go up. So, if they do need to rise in order to replace revenue that producers might have been getting from the federal instruments, that is definitely possible. But that's also part of that calculus about where we set the targets and, how aggressive we can be.
Thank you. Any other questions? You can go for it, yeah.
So a big part of y'all's programs is also, like you said, electricity. Electricity is cheaper. Both of your states have plans to get more EVs and more EV infrastructure. But of course, looking at emissions programs, you want to reduce transportation emissions, but you don't want to pass that emissions buck over to your power sector. I guess, how do y'all's programs kind of incentivize moving off fossil fuels while still balancing that need to, keep those emissions reductions and not create new problems for yourself?
Okay, I can start again. At some point, Jordan, you should probably hop in on one of these questions. But so the way that we tried to do it was by adopting renewable electricity provisions that explicitly targeted newer build renewable electricity projects. And then also required them to go through Green E certifications so that we could ensure that the carbon attributes of that renewable electricity were being maintained, and the program could justifiably claim them. Those are, for those of you who participate in the program, not the most popular provisions we've ever adopted, but I do think that that does target new build of renewable electricity and hopefully doesn't exacerbate the compliance issues around the decarbonization of electricity policies the state has. The data center and other demand growth that we're seeing outside of transportation electrification has also been causing concerns there, especially if we do see, there's just a ton of data centers being built out in the Pacific Northwest for AI and other purposes, and that is a very significant baseload demand growth that was not anticipated when a lot of the clean energy policies were being adopted. That is thankfully not my direct headache, but the renewable electricity provisions are how we were trying to help ensure that we were getting additional supply of low carbon electricity to transportation.
Yeah, I would just add that Washington has the same policy suite. So we also have it's called the Clean Energy Transformation Act, CETA. Requires electricity to be carbon neutral by 2030 and 100% non-emitting by 2045. And so that's co-occurring along with clean fuels, cap and invest, and our zero emission vehicles program. So I think the goal is that everything is sort of trending down at the same time.
Thanks, Joel. Jordan, I will bring you into the fold for this last question. The last panel had a question that I thought was quite good, was if you had 1 minute with the governor, kind of what would you want? I will not necessarily make you answer that, but if you had kind of one thing that you could achieve for your program, or one thing that is the most on your mind, what is that? And Jordan, if you could kind of speak to what you hear in the market in terms of what people are most keen to see.
Sure, I could start. People want certainty. We talk to a lot of traders and brokers in the market, and they don't care what the rules are, they just want to know the rules. There's been a lot of uncertainty, for example, with the 45Z tax credit this year. It's like crippled the biodiesel and industry, and has also had an effect on renewable diesel as well. The really rocky transition from a $1 per gallon blender's tax credit to who the hell knows if it's even legal 45Z tax credit. So, and the market, obviously, and most of the people in the room, I'm assuming, are in a similar boat of uncertainty when it comes to LCFS right now. So I think people just want to know the rules, and then once they know the rules, the credits, those that can basically do the job that they're meant to do, can be those levers to help people achieve their targets. But without knowing the rules, that's where we are right now with a wide variety of different commodities in the biofuel space. It's where we are with LCFS. So I think that's the biggest thing that I've heard that the market wants.
No, I agree. I mean, we're hearing the same thing in terms of both, cap and trade and LCFS, specifically for California, wanting, more clarity on that timeline. So I think that's a good point. Joel?
Well, I don't know, as somebody who serves at the pleasure of the governor, I don't know if I'm allowed to say how I would advocate in an elevator. But I haven't actually been in an elevator with our new governor yet. And Governor Bob Ferguson took office just this year. But I will say that, one of the things that his climate policy advisor and I talk about a lot is ways that we can provide him with opportunities to carry on Washington's strong legacy of climate leadership at a time when state-level climate leadership is more important than it was before. And so something that we have done for a number of years and want to continue under this governor, and that he's very supportive of, is helping, not only carry out our own policies successfully, but bringing other states along. We like to joke that we are we're the not California example of how to do things. When California can pull off an ambitious environmental regulation, everybody says, well, sure, but they're the 5th largest economy in the world, and they can just throw 30 staff at something and do it. And I don't mean to minimize their contributions, they're significant. But I think when a state like Oregon or Washington can do it, that shows many of the other states in the country that it's possible. So we have been having a lot of conversations with our peers at other states, and hope to keep doing that and build out a broader network of sub-national climate actors.
I'm going to go in a different direction with mine, partly because I think various people above me at my agency would also have heart attacks, so I was lobbying the governor directly. I think one of the things, especially because we've done a fair amount of hiring over the last year for my program, is just finding ways, either through internships or other things, just build up the talent pool for this segment of things. This is a very normie carbon markets conference, right? There are a fair number of people that do like the normal version of carbon markets. The clean fuels programs are very specialized. We need life cycle analysis. We're looking at regulating industries that are in a very detailed way that, you know, it's just hard to find people that have that experience. So when we're doing hiring, it is just, we're lucky if we get somebody who has some familiarity with one of the topic areas we need to hit on. But you know, finding ways to bring more people into these programs, bring them, like, get them educated, get them understanding, you know, how we're working through these things, and also just where the uncertainties are, right? Like, these are science-based programs. Like, I kind of skipped over a lot of what I could have talked through about all the things that got updated in the GREET model, but, you know, there is just a significant amount of work and body of research that goes into running these programs, and, you know, the talent pool is pretty shallow. I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean there's not that many people. Like, if I'm thinking of people who I go to for advice, it is not that long of a list of people. So, like, in terms of finding, you know, talented folks who are understanding these issues, that's just one of the ongoing struggles that I know some of my colleagues in the other jurisdictions have been having, and just finding a way to just have universities or others, like, look into these programs in more detail, or have, you know, some bigger talent pipeline than just ITS at UC Davis would be great.
And Bill's hiring, so tell all your friends.
Yes, that too.
I was somewhat gathering that from that.
Things that are currently on my mind.
We only have a couple minutes left, so this is just the last chance for any last audience questions before we wrap up. Well, then we'll leave it at that. Please join me in thanking the panelists. Oh, Jordan, please, yeah.
I have a question for the audience. Do you guys think CARB will get the LCFS rulemaking done by June 30th? No? It's show of hands. Does anyone think they'll get it done by June 30th? Oh, wow. Okay. So, and then who thinks they won't make June 30th? Okay. All right. We'll see.
Good question.
Well, on that note, please join me in thanking Bill, Joel, and Jordan.